Hey guys, Tom Barclay here. I have not been at Tottenham's press conference today. I've actually been at Chelsea's instead of Spurs. Got a bit of a change around at the last minute, but I have seen the quotes obviously from Spurs open section, so I thought I'd do a video on that. But it is interesting sometimes going to see other clubs and seeing how they do things and get a bit of perspective and a bit of time away, I suppose, from the Spurs bubble. For instance, with Chelsea, obviously with Tottenham, we live in this sort of state of injuries being a permanent topic and talking point and issue that Ange Postecoglou has to deal with. But when you go to other clubs, you realise it is a major deal for those clubs as well. Maybe not to quite the same extent as Tottenham, but it is something that Ange has been banging on about for quite a long time. How what they've experienced, it's going to be the same, or it is being the same for a lot of other clubs at the moment. And it is interesting for Chelsea's perspective. They've got 3 players coming back from injury for this game. Unfortunately for Spurs, in Cole Palmer, Noni Madueke and Nicholas Jackson, all 3 of who have a decent record, I guess, against Spurs. Actually, off the top of my head, I can't really think of a game for Madueke, but obviously history, having come through the ranks at Spurs. Palmer obviously scored in the 4-3, and Nicholas Jackson famously scored what's been dubbed as the worst hat-trick in a long time. Obviously, when Spurs went down to 9 men, he scored 3 in that 4-1, missed a bunch of other chances, but he's obviously a dangerous player. But Madueke and Jackson in particular have just come back from long-term hamstring injuries, which obviously sounds familiar with the situation at Spurs. So I guess it goes to show you that it's not just Tottenham, it is other clubs. And when you sort of spend as much time as I do as a journalist, and a lot of you guys do, just sort of following the one club, it is easy to sort of think it is just Tottenham it happens to, but it isn't just them, it is other clubs as well, and sometimes a bit of perspective is quite helpful on that front. But anyway, on to what Ange had to say today. Like I said, in the open section, quite a few interesting talking points. Some stuff he wanted to elaborate on, some things he really didn't want to elaborate on. Let's start with the fitness update. The big news, unfortunately, is that Dejan, Kulusevski and Kevin Danso are just still a few weeks away. I mean, it's getting to the point now with injury updates in press conferences where you always kind of half wondering how long it's going to be, if it's going to be as long as the suggested expectation, because often we have players taking longer than you'd hope. I think Ange might have said before the international break that he'd be looking in and around for after the international break for Kulusevski, but it's still a few weeks, unfortunately. He said 1 to 2 weeks in his press conference, but he said a few weeks in the, or maybe a couple of weeks away in his video with the in-house Spurs team. I had actually heard that Kulusevski missed training last week, and I thought he was still injured, but I couldn't quite stand it up. But it's interesting to hear and give him that kind of time frame. So obviously next week is the first leg of the absolutely pivotal match against Eintracht Frankfurt. You would imagine he would be a major doubt for that game based on the time frame. Fingers crossed he can be at least back for the second leg, which could be absolutely all important for Postecoglou in his future and Spurs' season. But not good news on that front. Richarlison is training with the full team now. There being a bit of open training ahead of the Alkmaar home game, where Richarlison was training on his own out on the grass, and Postecoglou was sort of watching him from the start of training, the bit that we got to see. He is now training with the team, and Ange says it's just about a matter of when he wants to bring him into the matchday squad. And I think he said tomorrow against Chelsea will be too soon, but hopefully the weekend. And I do think Richarlison's been missed, as much as people sort of have dismissed him because of the amount of games he's missed for Tottenham. He has been a good player for Postecoglou. Bergvall, apparently Lucas Bergvall is fine despite missing his chance to make his first start for Sweden through illness, but he should be okay. And then players like Romero, Udogie, Tell, Wilson Odobert, Andrew's pretty happy with the fact that they got lots of minutes for their countries to help boost their fitness. And that is an interesting point, actually, because Romero, I may do another video on this, I mean, it's quite a talking point, isn't he, Cristian Romero? And the fact that he played both sets of 90 minutes for Argentina, having only played, 68 minutes against Fulham, may have been a bit of bone contention for some fans. But Ange said he was absolutely delighted with it. He said he could tell that he was pretty cooked by sort of 70 minutes, 68 minutes against Fulham. But now having 2 more games under his belt for his country, will be very useful for Spurs. So, or that was me. That's kind of the inference that Ange was saying. He was happy with it. So he saw it as a positive rather than any kind of club v country issue. Whether fans will feel the same way, I don't know. But there you go. That's what he had to say. Actually, on Romero, because Romero's got 2 years left on his future, he was actually asked about Cristian Romero and his future in this press conference, and he said that he basically didn't want to get into it at all. He shut it down and just said all he's focusing on is the game tomorrow night. So that was the end of that. He was asked to expand on that interview with Optus Sports, which I did a bit of yesterday's video about, which was sort of talked about, branded as being about Spurs' annual financial results and Daniel Levy's comments. But I started it off talking about Ange's interview that he'd done with Mark Schwartz and Optus Sports, in which the two standout lines were, one, him saying he felt like a large part of the Spurs fan base had lost faith with him, or faith with the team at the moment, and also how he felt like he got the start of the season wrong and they went in too hard and should have gone a bit softer. And I was questioning in this video and on social media, interested to see him expand a bit more on what that actually all meant. And he was asked about that to sort of elaborate a bit further, and he sort of pushed back by saying, I think it was all there and go back and watch the video. Don't feel like I need to expand any further. But then he did a bit. He said that they always, they review things along the way and they'll review things towards the end of the season. But what he said was that there was a lot of players who missed a lot of pre-season and went into the season underdone, undercooked, like not quite ready really. And as a result, pre-season might look a bit different this coming season because they've got a bit, they don't have as many international commitments. Because obviously last season was off the back of the Euros and the Copa America, if I'm right. So a lot of players coming back from major tournaments, which seems to have impacted players all over the shop. I mean, just look at Phil Foden at Man City and the season he's had. But it's not just him, it's lots of other players, and it feels like Spurs have been affected as well. But Ange, in that interview with Mark Schwarzer, really did sort of hint at a regret, I suppose, of how he went about things at the start of the season. But he's elaborated it a little bit on here. Then he was asked about Mauricio Pochettino's comments about wanting to manage Spurs again in the future, and whether basically the timing of it was a bit disrespectful. And Ange said he didn't feel disrespected. He said that that Mauricio saying that he could come back one day. He said, I hope it happens for him if that's what he wants. But he said he didn't feel disrespected at all. Sort of batted that one off a little bit. But, I part of me was sort of thinking, like, slightly odd timing. I know when you're a manager and you get asked a question, you answer it honestly, which is kind of what Ange was using as Poch's defence. But I suppose he didn't have to go quite down that road when you've already got a manager in a position like Ange is. And I personally didn't feel like it was completely necessary from Poch's point of view. But Ange wasn't going to get embroiled in some sort of spat over Pochettino's comments, and was very sort of magnanimous, I suppose, over that situation. But he was also asked, and this is maybe the crux of this whole press conference, was about his own future, and obviously been so much talk during this international break about what Tottenham might do, who they might go for if they change. I've said before that there's Iriola and Marco Silva are two of the managers that I liked amongst the Spurs hierarchy. I would not be surprised if they were to make a change, if those two came into the reckoning. And obviously there have been other reports during this period. The Athletic went pretty strong on Iriola being first choice if they do make a change. And he was basically just asking, what is it like to have all this sort of these suggestions of someone else coming in for your job when you're still in position. And he was interesting. He said, I'm sure if the club decides to go a different direction, there are some outstanding candidates for it. But he also suggested, I'm sure there'll be slightly paraphrasing, there'll be a club out there who fancies a punt on Ange Postecoglou, basically hinting that it won't be the end of the world if something does change. Doesn't sound like it'd be a shock either. I imagine he seems pretty confident that he would probably get another job. I don't know where the Spurs fans are at on this. They generally seem to be pretty much, many of them who are vocal have decided they want to change. But there's always the sort of often silent majority, whether it's a majority anymore, who might think differently. I know a lot of you guys are a lot more sort of, who watch this are a little bit more sort of less vocal and shouty about this kind of thing, and there's a big following in Australia as well. So I imagine a lot of you are still very much behind Ange, but it'd be interesting to hear what your thoughts on where you see this going. Personally, I think it's all down to the Europa League. I don't really know how far he needs to get to sort of ensure he keeps his job. I think he'd be in danger if they lose to Eintracht Frankfurt. Obviously, if they win it, that would give them a great chance. I mean, it seems pretty crazy if they could sack someone after winning their first trophy in 17 years. But the in-between bit, I'm not so sure about. But it's interesting hearing Ange talk about it in that way. So let me know your thoughts on that one. And just finally, before we come on to the team, I just wanted to say as a happy birthday to Teddy Sheringham today. He's 59 today, absolute Spurs legend. Obviously, we've seen him score lots of goals for Spurs over the years, but the memory that I particularly have of Super Ted is Euro 96. That was the first tournament that I watched as a 9-year-old. Pretty much every moment of that tournament. Alan Shearer being my big hero growing up, obviously scored a load of goals, but Sheringham was his partner in crime, setting up so many of those goals along the way, not just in that tournament, but so many fixtures for England stick out. But obviously that famous goal for, I think it was the 4th goal against Holland, where Shearer bangs it into the corner, where Sheringham could have shot and lays it off with a beautiful sort of disguised pass. But he obviously scored a couple of goals in that game as well. Just a brilliant player. An example of a player who sort of stuck at it, I suppose. Had a good career, but I don't think he made it in England debut till 27, if I'm right, off the top of my head. And still went on to make about 50 odd caps. So that shows you the longevity that he had, which he then sort of went on to show with his career going well into his 40s, I think, or right up to his late 30s. But a great player for Spurs. Someone who, when you look back at the teams that he played in during that 90s period, he had a great connection with Darren Anderton, who's someone that I've interviewed quite a few times over the years. I've interviewed Teddy as well. But maybe the rest of the team wasn't quite as good technically as those two, and particularly Sheringham. I had a good combination, I think, with Klinsmann, but maybe if Spurs had some better players back then, he could have gone on to win things with Tottenham, or win more things. I'm trying to remember if he was involved. No, he wouldn't have been involved in that League Cup victory, because obviously he was at Man United winning the treble, which sums up my point of what a good player he was back then. But still scored a lot of goals for Tottenham, and an incredible player. So happy birthday to Teddy Sheringham. So onto the team. I mean, Ange's got a lot of options. Obviously, Kulusevski's not there. He's arguably his best player, so that's a big blow. But this could be the first time that he's had his 2 starting centre backs available and fit to start since Chelsea last time, which was a disaster of a day. They went 2-0 up, and Romero got injured. Actually, I'm not sure if it might be. I think they were 2-0 up when he came off for 15 minutes. Van der Ven obviously got injured later in the game. Spurs ended up losing 4-3, and they were 4-2 down at one point. Jadon Sancho's last goal, by the way, for Chelsea was that game. But typical Spurs for him to get back on the goal trail tomorrow. But hopefully Van der Ven and Romero are looking a lot fitter now and look more stable going forward. So you'd imagine it was those two at the back. Vicario obviously in goal. Then at fullbacks, I wonder what it will be, because Udogie's obviously played an international break. He's getting back and fitter. Whether it will be him at left back and Poch at right back, because I do feel like that's Ange's preferred back four, as well as Spencer's done in recent months. Because, as I say, Udogie's a natural left footer. Poch's got that creativity and crossing ability. And when Spurs have been their best under Postecoglou, it's been that back four. So it'd be quite telling, to be fair, to see if Spence starts, where he fits in now, whether that he has sort of dislodged either one of them into that starting back four. So that'll be interesting. Then you imagine it's Bentancur. He seems to be his preferred holding midfielder. And now if Bergvall, I think Bergvall's now a starter, but if he's been ill, perhaps it's Maddison and Sarr. Can't see it being Basuma. And then out wide, I feel like Odegaard has jumped ahead of Johnson with his performances, and he's very good over international break on the under-21s, particularly against England. So I imagine him on the right, Son on the left, and Solanke up top. But yeah, let me know what you think. Obviously, Tottenham got an absolutely terrible record against Chelsea. And these games at this point, how much does it matter? I've been saying that for a while. I seem to rile fans a little bit on this. Obviously, every game matters, but in the grand scheme of things, even a win, as much as it do confidence, won't really do a whole lot from the league's point of view. I suppose what's really crucial now is trying to change the form, change the narrative ahead of their massive game against Frankfurt next week. They should really be using this as a dress rehearsal, I suppose, because even if they pick up any kind of, obviously not major injuries, but any knocks or any issues going into Frankfurt, they could rest players against Southampton at the weekend. And as poor and as difficult as Tottenham form's been sometimes this season, Southampton are that bad that I think they could play a very rotated team and win that game. So they really need to go all guns blazing for a massive London derby, if not one that means as much as it has done for Spurs fans in recent years, and get ready for that absolutely massive game at home to Frankfurt in a week's time. Anyway, let me know your thoughts, guys. Cheers.